Angie Samoda was born in 1964 in Alameda, California, and she was the only child to a single mother. That didn't stop her from growing into a beautiful, intelligent, and extremely outgoing young woman. After high school, she went off to college at Southern Methodist in Dallas, Texas in the early 80s, where she studied computer science and electrical engineering. Angie was serious about school and studied into the wee hours of the night, but still somehow found time to make friends with just about everyone, often attending parties where she would light up the room. While at Southern Methodist, she met who would end up being her best friend, Sheila Wysocki. They had shared a dorm together before Angie went off and got her own off-campus condo. Around this time, Angie also met a man that she got serious with, a construction site supervisor named Ben McCall. So everything was going well for Angie. However, on October 12th, 1984, Angie went out with a couple of friends. This was a huge weekend in Texas, as Texas U was playing against Oklahoma in college football. And as you know, if you're from the South or just at all familiar with college football, that's a huge rivalry and a huge game. And it was also the state fair of Texas going on. So a lot to do in Texas that weekend. And Angie went out to the state fair with two friends. And one was a girl named Anita, and the other was a 23-year-old man that she had recently become friends with named Russell Buchanan, who he'd recently graduated and was going to grad school for architecture. But she had become friends with him, and her boyfriend was aware that they were going out together, and he had no issue with it. He, being a construction site supervisor, had to be up extremely early the next morning, so he was not about going out and partying. They went out that night, and they went out to Lakewoods Boardwalk, Shannon Wynn's restaurant, and in Shannon Wynn's restaurant, Angie, knowing everyone, made it to where they could get upstairs to kind of an exclusive hangout area of the restaurant called the Rio Room. And this was because Angie knew everyone. And, you know, Russell recalled how Angie was just amazing, how she was going up and just knew everyone in this place. They would hang out, have a good time until about 1 a.m. before they would finally leave. Angie dropping off Russell first, and he happened to live only 5 minutes from Angie's condo. Then she dropped off Anita and ultimately stopped by her boyfriend, Ben McCall's house. I kind of feel bad for Ben. I mean, I feel terrible for Ben for what goes on to happen, but even before what happens later in this night, her waking him up at, 1:30 in the morning when he's got work, just to say goodnight to him. But that says something about them and their relationship, I think, that she went out and had a great time, but she still wanted to go say goodnight to her boyfriend. She would end up making it home to her condo at about 1:45 a.m., but soon made a very eerie and troubling phone call to her boyfriend, Ben. And she was basically saying, I just want to stay on the phone with you and talk to you because something weird just happened. She claims that a man had knocked at her door and was asking to come in and use the phone at 1:45 in the morning when she had just gotten home. Very odd, leads you to believe that someone had been watching her, and she was freaked out, understandably. Then suddenly the phone gets disconnected mid-conversation, and Ben is extremely concerned at this point. He jumps in his truck and rushes over to her condo, calling from his truck phone. He had a work truck with, in 1984, this is pretty rare to have a phone in your vehicle, but he happened to have, a work truck that had one. So he's calling the condo all the way over there, no answer. He gets there and finds the door to the condo locked and the lights off. He then goes out to the parking lot and calls the police from his truck, and the police would arrive and gain entry to the condo at about 2:17 a.m., where they would find Angie brutally murdered. She'd been raped and stabbed, and she'd been stabbed so hard and many times that her heart was basically ripped out and was laying on her chest. Brutal, horrific murder. And as I mentioned, she had been raped, so there was a rape kit taken, and semen was tested that showed that the killer was a non-secretor, which was a good lead for them because only 20% of the population is a non-secretor, meaning, you don't leave any blood traces in your semen, or I think even saliva as well. It's a pretty rare thing. Unfortunately for Russell, the man that Angie had been out with that night, and the man that lived only 5 minutes from her condo, when they tested him, he also turned out to be a non-secretor. This would put a ton of pressure on Russell. He would become the main focus for the investigators at this point, for good reason. I mean, he's one of the last men to be with her. He was not in a relationship with her, but Who knows what his motivations were? He had asked her out in the past. He lives 5 minutes from the condo, and he's a non-secretor, which is only 20% of the population. And the killer, they know, also matches that. However, as much as the police continued to grill him, he stuck to his story, and they were not able to get him to confess to something because, as it turns out, he didn't do it. And eventually he would go off to England for graduate school, and this case would go cold, and this case would stay cold for 2 decades plus. Angie's best friend, however, Sheila Wysocki, was not about to let this thing go. She claims to have had a vision one night with Angie standing over her bed, and she took it as though Angie was begging her from the grave to basically continue to push and find her killer and get closure. So she began protesting and pestering the police on a daily basis, calling them nonstop. And even eventually, when she wasn't getting any help from the police and they weren't reopening the investigation, she decided to become a private investigator. I love this. She was just obsessed. And finally, in 2006, 20 something years past Angie's murder, Dallas police assigned a new detective to the case, a woman named Linda Crum. Linda took what was left of the DNA from the rape kit in storage and used advanced DNA technology to get a profile of the killer and added it to the felony offender database. And basically this database started tracking to see if this DNA matched anybody they had in the system. It would take 2 years, but finally in 2008, DNA would find a match. And it wasn't who the police and who Sheila were both convinced it had been all along. Poor Russell Buchanan. It was actually a lifelong serial rapist who had just happened to be at the bar that night and caught a fancying to Angie. And he was actually out on parole for, you guessed it, aggravated rape at the time of Angie's murder. So he had raped someone, gotten out on parole, and did this. And he'd actually, shortly after raping and killing Angie, raped another woman, violating his parole and sending him to prison for 25 years. Nonetheless, all that time, they had not known that he was the killer of Angie until 2008, when his DNA finally matched up with the killer. In 2008, Donald Bess, the killer that the DNA matched up to, was 60 years old and weighed about 350 pounds. Unbelievably, as I mentioned, he'd been on parole during the time of Angie's murder for aggravated rape. And, shortly after that, been locked up for a 25-year sentence and been in bars, thankfully, all this time. But finally, the killer came out of the darkness, and he was subsequently found guilty of Angie's rape and murder and sentenced to death. Shortly after they matched the DNA, it only took an hour for the jury to deliberate and find him guilty. Unfortunately, he was found guilty back in 08, 09, and still sits on death row to this day. We know how that process goes. Nonetheless, he'll never get out, and being, the age he is and the weight that he is, he's probably not going to ever be killed before he dies of heart disease or something behind bars. But thankfully, due to technology and persistence on the part of Angie's best friend, Sheila, this thing finally got solved. And it says a lot about people that just don't give up on things and don't let things go. Those moms out there, those best friends that just continue to push, and then also technology and DNA and good detectives like this new detective that came onto the scene and had that DNA that had been sitting around, finally entered into the system. We got closure on this case, and this sick bastard, although he was already locked up for life, now, it ensures that hopefully he'll be killed behind bars. Hopefully that happens. But that's it for me this week. Hope you guys enjoyed this week's 5-Minute Murder. See you next time.